Hello, BookTube, and welcome to your Daily Penguin. This is our crawl through my Penguin Classic wall. I originally was doing a book tour, a whole library tour in 2019, where you know, the usual way that you do it, you go to a shelf and you pull out book after book, have a little conversation about each one of them and put them back. And I was thinking of doing the same thing for my penguins, just shelf by shelf. But I ran out of time in that library tour, and then I realized, now, these things mean too much to me. I love them too much, obviously, since I have a whole wall of them. I love them too much to do that. And a lot of them are my oldest bookish friends, so they require more time. So we're doing it book by book and author by author, and we're in the ancient world. And today we're dealing with someone who was a friend or acquaintance of authors that we have already seen, like Juvenal or Pliny the Younger. And he raises a couple of the questions. Two of the main issues that we have been dealing with in the ancient world in our March of the Penguins has been questions of translation, of course, because these are all Penguin Classic English translations of works from ancient Greece or ancient Rome or ancient Judea or even other places. And also what I've been calling the pitiless ratio, which is these things are not only coming to you, if you're getting them in a Penguin Classic, they're not only coming to you through the tiny keyhole of translation, which is tough to do, especially when the two languages involved are radically different or different kinds of languages. But also the tiny keyhole of survival at all, of ancient authors who wrote prolifically. We know they wrote their whole lives long and were read by everybody, and yet we don't have anything by them. None of their work survives 2,000 years of floods and fire and termites and mice and whatnot. None of it does. Floods and fire and termites and mice. And I might also mention here, I won't harp on it too much, but also book burning by Christians, which accounts for more of these classic world disappearances than all natural disasters put together, easily. Book burning by Christians, I should be the first danger that I cite. I don't want to ruffle any feathers, but nevertheless, that pitiless ratio almost always applies. We have seen a couple of cases where it doesn't, but most of the time it does. Where we see an author like Aeschylus, and we know that he wrote plays for his whole life and wrote a whole library full of them, and we only have a handful. Same thing with Sophocles, same thing with Euripides, same thing with Tacitus, same thing with Livy. These authors who we know they were renowned, we know they were well liked, and yet, and if they were renowned and if they were well liked, that means they were also well copied, extensively copied. Of course, this is a time when all copies were made by hand. They were made by trained slaves, with usually a freedman overseer, in the street of booksellers, so that you could go into a bookseller shop and you were in that bookseller shop judging not only the quality of the inventory and also the quality of the service, but also the quality of the craftsmanship, because it was all being done in the one place. And we know that there were authors, a lot of the authors that we've been talking about, who had a regular industry of that sort of thing. Their books were well known. And yet, there are huge gaps, or they don't survive at all except by name. And sometimes you can be sure even the name doesn't survive. And both of those things come into play with the author that we're dealing with today. This is the Roman poet Martial. And this is the volume in the Penguin Classic series that they did, that I'm getting the impression from some of you that these things are not available, that Penguin doesn't make them anymore, and that they're not even particularly available secondhand, that they tend to be pricey secondhand. I don't know why Penguin doesn't continue to make these and expand the list. But what these volumes were, the editors would take, the editor in question here is J.P. Sullivan and A.J. Boyle. What the editors in question would take an ancient author and run through 4 or 5 centuries of different translations of their work, from all kinds of different hands, all kinds of different schools of philosophy and translation ideas, so that you could see the variation that's possible, and also you could see the engagement that all kinds of literaries have had with these figures. Penguin did volumes like this for a whole bunch of names, and then I guess they stopped. And I have the Martial in English without having the Penguin Classic Martial volume itself. Penguin also does a volume called The Epigrams of Martial, and I don't have that volume, and there's a good reason why I don't. I'm not gonna traumatize you again. I traumatized quite a few of you by saying that not only did I not like the Greek tragedy in Euripides, but that I disliked him for critical reasons, not just because he didn't suit me, but that I look at his plays and I see huge faults in them. If he were working today, I would pan him in a review. That traumatized a lot of you, and I understand why it did, because for all of those flaws, I hoped that I was making this point in my video, for all of those flaws, Euripides has tremendous emotional power. He lived at a time when his whole world was trembling on its axis and looked to be falling apart, and he didn't live long enough to see his world end. He didn't live long enough to see Athens sign a groveling peace surrender in a long war. He could see it coming, but he didn't live long enough to know that it happened. So, and that is all through his work, and it lends his work an amazing emotional charge, an emotional depth that doesn't have anything to do with whether or not characters have a reason for being on stage or whether or not they stay in character. I was just saying those things bother me because even in the paltry selection of ancient Greek tragedians that we have, 2 others, those mistakes aren't made. And that emotional power is every bit as great or greater. So, now that I don't mean to traumatize you all over again. But the reason that I don't have the Penguin Classic version volume of Marshall, if I saw it in a trade paperback at the Brattle bookshop, I would get it. But I don't have it right now. I have this because I'm interested in all of the different translators. One of the values of these English volumes is that you will get samples of work from people who don't have anthologies of their own. They were once promising poets or famous poets of their own, but the pitiless ratio applies to them as well, and we don't remember fourth-rate Restoration poets. We don't remember them, and maybe we would like them if we did, and these volumes have a ton of those people. But the reason that I haven't gone out of my way to get the Penguin Classic volume devoted just to one person's translation of Marshall, I don't even remember who it is who does the translation, is because Marshall's not all that good. He's in fact rather bad. He's an epigrammatist. He writes epigrams usually. Some of them are longer. He writes longer sing-songy ditty poems. They are mostly reflect on ordinary city life, sordid city life. They're sexist. They're racist. They're classist. They're all the ists that you could ask for in the 21st century. And the thing that would save them. The 21st century doesn't know this. The blue check marks on Twitter don't know this. But the thing that saves material like that is if it's funny. I know. It's total heresy in 2020 to say that saves anything. But it in fact does. It's not my fault that a whole bunch of junior G grade 18-year-old public censors on social media don't have any sense of humor. That's not my fault. One way or another. Marshall often isn't funny. He often doesn't have that to save his work. He was born probably around the reign. We don't really know for sure, but probably around the reign of the Emperor Claudius. So he came of age. He wasn't a Roman, but he was a talented outsider. And by that point, talented outsiders were working and mixing in all levels of Roman society, and Roman society didn't know it, but they were about to go right to the top. Non-Romans were about to go right to the top. First you have an Italian becoming emperor, not a Roman, but an Italian. But then, and passing the crown on, the whatever you call it. You're not supposed to call it a crown because the Romans hated the word king. But he passes it on to his sons. But then shortly after that, you have a Spaniard becoming emperor and being succeeded by another Spaniard. So that intermixing of people who aren't particularly Roman had already started happening long since in Marshall's day. And by the time he reached adulthood, he was demonstrating his true colors by being a horrible, horrible person. Aside from the bad humor and the coarseness and the stupidity and the shallowness of his work, you can also tell when you read these. I mean, some of those qualities are poses, or can be, right? A poet can take a pose of being a coarse, vicious nincompoop. But a poet can't sustain that over a whole lifetime of work. If you get that note being sounded very regularly or all the time in a poet's work for their whole career, then they were a horrible, cramped jerk. And you get that impression when you read Marshall. You don't need to know anything about him. But I'm here to tell you, that impression is correct. He curried favor as a cringing toady with the very worst kind of people in the world. Not just starting at the top with the Emperor Domitian, but going all the way down. He toadied to anyone who could advance him a little in his career, who could get him a few social or governmental favors for him or his cronies. It shows in his writing. And the reason why I bring up the pitiless ratio is not because Marshall comes to us through that same keyhole. It's because that same keyhole is indifferent to the quality of the things that it is saving. We saw this already with a second-rate historian whose work we have, when we don't have the work of first-rate historians. And this is another thing. Marshall's ditties were very popular. They were set to music. A lot of them were set to little skit comedy stage productions. They provide an incredibly interesting look at daily life in Rome, of what daily life for non-Roman emperors was like. But that would only have been of interest from the late Renaissance on, even later than that. The initial 7 centuries that would have been responsible for saving Marshall at all wouldn't have cared about such things. And they saved him because his ditties are funny, some of them, and easy to memorize, and easy to sing-song and jog-trot along. And I'm not denying the value of that. If you want to write, for instance, if you want to write Roman historical fiction set in the early imperial era, you have to read Marshall. You have to study him. Because he has no reason, you can see when you read his epigrams and his longer poems, he has no reason to falsify any of that stuff. You have to read him and Horace and Catullus and Propertius. You have to read these poets who aren't Virgil. These poets who are trying to convey what it's like to live in Rome and little details involved in what it's like to live in Rome. The reason I don't have a Marshall volume dedicated to him is not... the Marshall volume that I would have would be one translator. And Marshall is not all that difficult. His Latin's not all that difficult to translate, but it does present you with a different translating problem. Again, it's a problem that we've seen in writers sort of kind of like him. If you're in ancient Rome and you're doing very topical, scathing satire comedy, quick little epigrams, you will mention people, you will name people in your verse, and sometimes it will be a name that your readers will recognize. We know a lot about the slander and libel laws of ancient Rome. Poets would have had a large amount of latitude, especially if they could regularly be seen at the theater in the emperor's box. You certainly wouldn't bring a case against such a person for maligning you in public. You might have them beaten up, but you wouldn't do anything legal. And translators in the modern time, and also, as you see in a book like this, translators for centuries, have had to decide what to do with those names and with specific references. Do you keep them in order to preserve Marshall just the way you found him? Or do you update them so that you give your reader an immediate sense of what is being joked about here? Which of those do you do? And if you update them, and this book is absolutely full of updates like that now need their own updates there, because they're all about things that don't exist anymore. So I thought I would read you a few examples. I want to read you 2 examples of the same epigram, done by 2 very different people, to give you an idea of what we're talking about here. The first one is by Charles Cotton, who flourished in the 1650s. Was a staunch royalist, was very much against Cromwell, and every single squire's son took to Marshall in the last 500 years. They don't do it anymore. Squire's sons don't read anymore. They play World of Warcraft. But once upon a time, you took to Marshall and you did little left-handed translation exercises. Almost nobody made any money by translating Marshall, but still, he translates an epigram. Brace yourself for the brilliance. Let's see here. Can there be greater madness, pray reply, than that one should, for fear of dying, die? How profound. And that is his sort of brushed, clean version of the epigram in question. Then we'll move on. We'll move on to George Lamb, who's a significantly more formidable figure, and who translates the same thing, but he does it much closer to the original Latin. Brave Phineas slew himself from foes to fly. What madness this, for fear of death to die. So there you see, the Cotton turned it into an apothegm. He turned it into like a nameless truism that that you could apply just philosophically. Imagine being so afraid of dying that you die of that fear. Wouldn't that be ironic? Wouldn't that be a madness? Lamb brings you closer to Marshall by bringing you closer to the actual idea. Marshall was actually talking about someone who was running from his enemies to such an exorbitant extent that he died of that flight. And Phineas probably isn't the name of that person, but probably would have been close enough so that readers would have known whom he was talking about. That is probably reflecting. It's a quip, is what it is. It's not really even poetry. It's a quip, reflecting on one little thing of the day. It would have been in a slim little book, a scroll, with, I don't know, 3 dozen, 4 dozen others. Not very expensive unless it was a really nicely done work, but that is Marshall. Now you might be thinking, well, okay, but I don't know this Cotton fellow from A Hole in the Wall, and of course nobody does anymore. That's one of the values of these volumes. And Charles Lamb, honored be his name, does not come down to us with any fame as a poet. What if we were to move on to either a poet or a classicist? What would they make? So let's do that. Let's move on to Rolfe Humphreys, which is a name. I wonder if they give a description here. He was a famous classicist. He did a lot of really good, solid selling translations in the mid-20th century. Some of you will probably have some of his translations on your shelf. And let's see here. Let's find one of his, what he does. So he's not a poet, but he is a classicist. So he's looking straight at Marshall. Let's see. Let's do an epigram of his. Okay, here we go. It was hard to pick. They're all shining with such brilliance. Let's pick this one. You say, to start with, you have laryngitis. Stop right there, Maximus, and you'll delight us. You see what I mean. So, not to belabor it, but you get the funny part there is that the character tells you he has laryngitis, and if he just stopped talking, that'd be great, because we don't like him. He's a bore. He's a drone. Okay. Right now, some of Marshall is longer than epigrams. Not every poem in here or in his extended body of work is just 2 lines. But they all have that kind of flavor to them. They broaden just a bit, they deepen just a bit when Marshall's reflecting on his country house and on the kind of Horatian peace and quiet that he can have there. But even there, he's lying. And you can tell it. You know for sure. When Horace talks about his little Sabine farm, you know for sure that he's telling the truth. You can feel the pang of it in him. Now, we said about Horace that when he was in the country, having simple wine with his servants, having a few friends over, far away from the hubbub of Rome, that he loved it, but he also missed Rome. And when he was in Rome, in the middle of the city, with carts going by all day long, he longed for the peace and quiet of the country. The thing about Horace, the thing that makes you love him, is that you know from reading him, you can feel it even in English translation, that both those feelings are completely true. And you know they're true because you probably felt something like them yourself. With Marshall, you just know he's lying. When he talks about the simplicity and the quiet and the peace and the basic honesty of his country retreat, you know he's lying. But although he's lying in those poems, he is displaying more poetic chops than he does in any of those epigrams or any of his city type stuff. When he writes about, some of it can be interesting. There's a little epigram about how urging you to reflect on death, but how he's looking down on a monument, a death monument to Julius Caesar from his garret window. And you can extrapolate from that a lot of people probably had views of a lot of things from their apartments. Roman apartments would go up way off the street, and some of them had windows. So you can extrapolate things like that from that. And his country-looking poems, I don't believe that any more are actually written in the country, but his country-looking poems force him into greater metrical complexity than the simple epigrams do, and it turns out he's capable of it. So those can be interesting to read as well, not in English. I've never seen it done in English, and I don't think anybody's in a hurry to translate Marshall in any new editions. I guess maybe a new edition could be made interesting, because he does reflect a lot of his time. The thing the subtle, very subtle, almost undetectable current of dislike that you're detecting in this video comes from the fact that for me, he's reflecting lots of stuff that doesn't need reflecting. I'd rather not. I'd rather get buried and not known. And there's also the irritation of knowing that if we get a whole literary tradition of Marshall, then what kinds of writers in his day do we not have that we maybe wish we did? Marshall, for instance, makes fun of grand, serious, epic poets of his day, some of whose names we know, but almost no work we have. I'd be willing to bet some of that work is really good. So I'd be willing to bet that some of it is a lot better than Marshall or anything that he wrote. Anyway, once Domitian fell from power, we had a very brief interval with an old man named Nerva, and then the Spaniard emperor that I mentioned, Trajan, came to power. Trajan had led legions in combat forever and ever. He was basically a military commander, and first, and an emperor a distant second. And although Trajan was very fond of keeping company with muscular teenagers, he was about as cis-normative as anybody gets, and he had no use for the simpering evil of someone like Marshall. And Marshall quickly knew. We have no anecdotes of Marshall lolling and peeling grapes in Trajan's theater box. And soon after Trajan came to power, he retired. And good riddance to him. So that is your Daily Penguin for today. I should stress again, as if it needs stressing at this point, that these videos are my personal reflections on these videos. Are not meant to be tutorials. These are my personal reflections on some of these artists. I could just hear all the Euripides fans out there going, "Oh no, he's going after Marshall." But at least with Euripides, you have a legitimate reason to be loyal. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now. Maybe tomorrow I'll pick somebody that we can all agree on. Or maybe not, or maybe all not care about. But anyway, I will wrap this up, and I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.